Well, thanks, Federico, for the invitation. It's such a pleasure to visit. I've been having one-on-one meetings and really enjoying them. And I always start by saying, I really wish I could visit in person. Uh, COVID makes it possible to sort of travel within minutes. So that is certainly a convenience, but nothing replaces the interaction one-on-one, in person, lunches, dinners. So my mini compensation for that is that I have some Chilean Malbec open for tonight. So I'm looking forward to sort of a mini Chilean experience. So it's a real pleasure to visit. I know that in many central banks, there are serious research departments, but it seems like in Chile, it is especially true. And this must also reflect the fact that you have terrific data. So I hope that there will be a lively discussion today, and please feel free to jump in with questions anytime. Looking forward to your comments. I'm going to share my screen, and do let me know if you cannot see my slides. So it should now be full screen and I'm going up and down. Okay, great.
Yeah, that's working great.
Perfect. So this is joint work with Hanwei Huang, who is at City University Hong Kong, and Frank Fish, who is at the University of St. Gallen. And the paper is broadly divided by two phenomena. On the one hand, we have seen the rise of global value chains and the increasing fragmentation of production, both across firm boundaries and across country borders. And when we think about globalization, that is really a key feature in recent decades. This has transformed the landscape of international trade because it means that firms stand to benefit from additional opportunities in participating in global markets, but they might also be exposed to more risks and shock transmission. The second phenomena that has been on the rise is from heterogeneity. As trade economists, as macroeconomists, we're used to thinking about heterogeneous firms, and we know that relocations across heterogeneous firms are very important for the adjustment to various shocks. Recently, it's been not just from heterogeneity per se, but also the rise of superstar firms. In other words, extreme skewness in the distributions of firm size and market share. And this has been accompanied by a rise in industry concentration and markups, which obviously has implications for consumer welfare. So we think it's important to think about these phenomena and how they interact, in large part because this informs important policy questions. I've already alluded to some of this, but when you think about the effects of globalization, you want to understand mechanisms at the micro level, at the firm level, so that you can better understand the impact in the aggregate. And as a policymaker, once you see something in the aggregate, once you understand the mechanisms, you understand perhaps how to better design policy to respond to shocks. And here we can be very broad in what we mean by policy. This clearly has implications not just for optimal trade policy, but also for optimal industrial policy. Recently, there's been interest in regional policy as well, right? Because of this heterogeneity across firms, sectors, and regions in the economy. So in this paper, we're going to try to make steps towards understanding how these phenomena interact, global value chains and firm heterogeneity. And to do that, we will think about the role of imperfect competition for the formation of global production networks and the implications for the gains from trade. The first part of the paper will introduce a formal theoretical model that allows us to kind of conceptualize these questions. So this will be a quantifiable general equilibrium model of global sourcing. It will have three key ingredients. First, we want to have two-sided firm heterogeneity. So in other words, we want to think about heterogeneity in firm productivity upstream among input suppliers, as well as among downstream buyers, downstream producers. Then we want to think about the endogenous formation of the network. So we want to be able to speak to the role of matching frictions in how buyer-supplier matches are formed. And finally, we want to understand the implications of imperfect competition upstream. Here, we're going to focus on oligopolistic competition with the idea that, you know, this rise in superstar firms really is about the role of markets where you have relatively few. So in other words, we need to think about sort of a discrete number of trade partners. We're going to keep the downstream market simple and standard with monopolistic competition. A key feature of the network formation is that if you want to match with more suppliers, you incur higher fixed costs. So as a downstream buyer, you basically make these optimal sourcing decisions. And endogenously, more productive downstream firms will choose to match with more suppliers. And this will benefit their overall productivity, overall marginal cost, and as a result of that, their sales and profits. In particular, because we have this combination of two-sided heterogeneity, matching frictions, and oligopolistic competition upstream, matching with more suppliers will lower input costs through 3 channels. One standard channel is variety gains. So as a producer, when you can use more inputs in production, this will allow you to produce your output product more cheaply. Secondly, because there will be match-specific shocks, essentially buyer-supplier cost shocks, when you match with more suppliers, you will be able to more effectively allocate input purchases among suppliers. And this will generate additional cost savings if you think about your overall margin. Finally, and this will be the most novel feature of the model, if you match with more suppliers, you actually induce tighter competition among them. So each of your suppliers is induced to lower their markups. And essentially, you're going to have these pro-competitive gains from trade. So in general, all firms will be able to match with more suppliers if you lower entry barriers upstream. So, lower entry barriers upstream, more upstream entry, more potential suppliers. But in practice, because there are fixed costs of matching with suppliers, these will be the most productive firms that actually change their sourcing strategy the most in response to such a shock upstream. And what this suggests is that in general, these kind of production networks and oligopolistic competition cases, right, they amplify the productivity advantage of downstream firms. And especially if there's additional entry upstream, this will further amplify this productivity advantage, this dispersion downstream. It's interesting to compare the effects of lower entry barriers to other relevant shocks. So you might consider trade policy, which lowers trade costs, or you might think that something about the technology of network formation is changing. Maybe there are expert promotion strategies. Maybe there's IT, information technology changes. Maybe there are changes in the market for intermediation services. But any of these things, right, would lower matching costs. If trade costs fall, if matching costs fall, all downstream firms will be able to source more efficiently at lower costs. As a result of that, all firms will in principle benefit from matching with more suppliers at lower cost. This time, the gains will actually be greatest for firms in the middle of the productivity distribution. And the intuition for that is that the set of potential suppliers hasn't actually changed. And so highly productive firms are still sort of maxing out and matching with as many suppliers as they can. And so yes, on the margin, falls in trade or matching costs or their marginal costs, but there is no kind of extensive margin of additional suppliers. Whereas for mid-productivity firms, the drop in trade or matching frictions can be significant and therefore induce them to actually re-optimize how they source globally. So that's the theory. Empirically, we're going to provide consistent evidence that changes in the market structure upstream actually causally affects sourcing outcomes downstream. The particular context we take is the rise of China in the early 2000s. This is following China's entry into WTO. And we'll look at how this affects the sourcing behavior of French firms downstream. Now, Chile has fantastic data. I know that you have information on the domestic production network, buyer suppliers in the customs records. For this project, we're not using that kind of data. In other work, I have been working with domestic production network data for Belgium, and with several different projects, I'm using customs data for different countries. It has information on foreign buyers and suppliers. For this particular project, however, it turns out it is sufficient to work with the standard customs data. From the French perspective, you have information on French firm-level imports by product and country of origin. And you see which French firms are sourcing inputs from China, at what prices, what quantities and values, and so on. Likewise, for China, we see firm-level exports by product and destination country. And so you have information on the set of Chinese suppliers that provide a given product to the global market. The reason why we don't need matched firm-to-firm sales data is because we're trying to get at the causal effect of changes in the market structure in China on the downstream sourcing behavior in France. And the logic will be that France is a relatively small market from the perspective of Chinese firms. By contrast, China is actually a pretty important supplier of French firms, and it increases share of total French import. And of course, China experienced this dramatic growth, which is exogenous to what was going on in France at the time. So essentially, we will be looking at the sourcing behavior of French firms, at the firm product level. But our proxy for the market structure in China will be a product level variable that collects different information about Chinese firms upstream. The model-based measure of the upstream market structure is very simple. The model tells you all you need to know is the number of Chinese suppliers of a given product. And so to be perfectly careful, we're going to look at the number of Chinese firms that can sell a given product to the rest of the world. You can certainly do it by looking at the number of Chinese firms selling to France. And from the perspective of one French firm, that number is still exogenous. But we're being extra cautious and look at the number of Chinese suppliers to the rest of the world. I will also show you some additional evidence where we use a couple of different IV strategies. One is based on reforms that China implemented, which relaxed size restrictions, minimum size restrictions for export licenses in China. And that I have today. We have actually produced another set of IV results that I don't yet have available in the slides. It's not been disclosed, but we are actually looking at the number of Chinese firms exporting specifically to the US, which is by far the most important market for China, and the results are extremely robust. I've been discussing the customs data. I should have mentioned that for both France and China, we can match this transaction level customs data to very standard balance sheets for French and Chinese firms respectively. This is useful from the perspective of French downstream buyers. This will allow us to explore differential effects across firms of different size and productivity to test model predictions. What we find is that entry upstream does increase import quantities and purchases for downstream firms. It lowers their imported input prices. And these effects are bigger for more productive firms downstream. So all of these results are perfectly in line with what the model would predict. And I should emphasize they're difficult to reconcile with alternative models that don't have those pro-competitive gains from trade. With alternative models, in other words, that don't have imperfect market structure upstream. Something that is still in progress is the quantification. We would love to do a few counterfactual exercises. The challenge is that we're working with a general equilibrium model that has a high dimensional combinatorial discrete choice optimization problem, right? Because each downstream firm is choosing a discrete set of suppliers of the available options upstream. The strategy is to take some parameters from the literature and estimate others based on gravity-style expressions that the model delivers for trade flows at the firm level. We're working on that right now. We have done some preliminary counterfactuals where we simply, calibrate parameters with numbers from the literature. Based on that, qualitatively, I can tell you what results we get, and they're fairly intuitive. So we see that lower entry barriers upstream, lower trade costs, and lower matching costs increase from productivity downstream, meaning lower marginal cost downstream. Because more productive firms tend to benefit more, size dispersion increases, and of course consumer welfare goes up significantly as well. What we're yet to do is essentially decompose these effects into different channels. We want to quantify, what is the contribution of those three key model ingredients to this overall welfare effect. So you can basically shut down one of those three features at a time. Time permitting, I will give you just a very brief overview of where we are at with this at the end, but it's still in progress, so I would rather not speculate too much. Last word before I actually pause for questions, let me try to position this into literature. I know that because you have fantastic data in Chile, a number of you are actually working on production networks and have been thinking about network formation, shock propagation, in the micro, but also the macro implications. So you're probably quite familiar with this literature. Where we see it splitting is essentially speaking through three strands of literature. The first line of research is, of course, global value chains. And here the literature started by thinking very generally about trade in intermediate goods. And essentially, there was little interest in two-sided firm heterogeneity. So essentially, downstream firms were matching with anonymous suppliers upstream. There were no matching frictions, sort of ubiquitous sourcing. The next generation of models had, roundabout production and so on. More recently, of course, there's been interest in how buyers and sellers match in production networks. Some of the earlier papers would take those networks as given and try to understand their properties. So the matching network is given on the extensive margin. Of course, other papers try to model that endogenous network formation. I think what we bring here to the table is being careful about two-sided firm heterogeneity with endogenous network formation. But perhaps the most novel ingredient is featuring imperfect competition. So by and large, the existing literature assumes monopolistic competition and constant markups upstream. It is challenging to introduce imperfect competition, and we're choosing to do it upstream while keeping the downstream quite standard. This is validated by kind of our particular institutional context. But in principle, it would be fascinating to think about imperfect competition both upstream and downstream. And in some ongoing research in the development literature, they're trying to study those questions with more micro-level data for, say, specific supply chain, for commodity products in Africa or something like that. That's one line of research. Further, there's a much older literature on trade with imperfect competition, and we're essentially bringing that up to, the frontier work on global value chains with matching frictions. Finally, more macro, outside of trade, there is growing interest in what networks imply, or production networks imply, for the firm size dispersion and shock propagation. And so I think what we've learned from this particular project is that the combination of those three model ingredients can amplify some of the mechanisms that are already present in production networks in macro, right? So if you think about shock transmission, one result that comes out of the literature is that granularity matters. If a shock hits a big firm, then it has a keynote in the network, and therefore this can generate more waste and repercussions for the rest of the network. I think our framework would suggest that these effects get amplified because of the way different firms source in the network. Let me pause here, see if there are any comments or questions at this point.
I have one, Kalina. I'm Ernesto here,
Sure.
From the bank. So if I understand correctly, the forces here pointed toward decrease in markups. But there is this big literature that tells that markups are increasing around the world. So I wonder whether there is a way in which results here may be square with this other evidence, or there is a connection between the two.
So that's an excellent question. That's a very interesting question. I don't see that there's a contradiction. We are focusing on an empirical application in which we actually saw more entry upstream, right? Because China expanded tremendously many more firms entered into production and exporting in China. There was also some secular productivity growth in China. And as a result of that, it's not perhaps surprising that when you look at firms sourcing from China, they may have benefited from lower markups. If you think about final consumer goods, of course, they're produced further down the supply chain. So if you think of China as occupying, higher segments of the value chain, or maybe somewhere in the middle, the assembly stages, that's not going to necessarily tell you what's happening to markups that reach final consumers downstream. So I think one of the reasons why, kind of as a research agenda for all of us, it's important to understand imperfect competition, is to inform precisely this markup setting along supply chains, and to think about the implications for consumer welfare at the end of the day.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. You might actually have insights on this as well, and feel free to jump in and contribute. I'd love to learn from your work. Great. So let's move on.
Kalina, sorry, can I ask another question? So like relative, I want to sort of understand sort of relative to, so I guess relative to Kikawa's work, what you're adding here is kind of making the network endogenous, I guess, because I think he had imperfect competition and two-sided heterogeneity, but I think the network wasn't endogenous in his case.
Yeah.
And then relative to, say, Arkolakis, Costino, Donaldson's paper about, pro-competitive effects of trade. I guess there you're sort of adding all the network part to that.
All the network part, the two-sided heterogeneity, the endogenous network formation. Yeah.
Okay, and you want to claim that, I guess, that their results would sort of change when you add the interactions through the production network, that it would be more competitive effects of trade once you take into account how the network responds endogenously. Is that correct, or?
We want to do that comparison. We have not yet done it. So as a counterfactual, you can basically say, take our structure and entry upstream, entry cost upstream, and, figure out what the welfare implications are. And then you can say, imagine that you shut down upstream from heterogeneity, or imagine that you bring down matching costs to zero, and then run everything again. What would be the welfare gains? Then you can compare those two numbers. I think the model is, we don't have an analytical answer to that. We need to, simulate the model and then do those kind of counterfactuals. But that is exactly the kind of exercise we have in mind. I know that at the individual firm level, the patterns can be different. And this sort of heterogeneity across firms is important. The fact that some firms are going to benefit more than others.
Okay, and then connecting, so and finally connecting to what Ernesto was saying, so the model would be consistent with aggregate trends in which globalization is rising, say because there's a generalized decline in trade costs, and markups are increasing as well. So those two trends would be possible to reconcile through the lens of the model?
That's interesting. It's not something I have thought about. So exactly. So the falling trade costs will certainly imply that more firms will be able to source globally, right? What this would mean for markups, I have to think about, because I think the falling trade costs will change the market structure in many places potentially, right? We know, for example, from even the simple Mallet's framework, that when trade costs fall, productivity cutoff for survival is going up. So effectively, you have firm exit, right? Rather than entry into production. You have entry into exporting, but exit from production. And so the mass of domestically active firms goes down, but the measure of varieties available to consumers is going up because you're importing from many more suppliers than from many more producers than before. So that's sort of a Mallet's world with no trading intermediates. And I would have to think, how would a change in trade costs affect these productivity cutoffs when you have trade networks, right?
Okay.
Great. So I will actually start by looking at the data and showing some stylized facts that motivate the way we build the model, and then turn to the theory. I will focus on the main empirical predictions of the model and kind of provide you the intuition for those propositions. But I will have to kind of introduce some notation and walk you through some of the derivations, in a sense, some of the logical steps that allow us to solve the model. And I will make sure to save enough time to go over the empirical evidence. Great. So as I mentioned, we're making use of data for China and France. For each country, we can match standard administrative surveys with standard balance sheet variables at the firm level to standard customs data. So the customs data for both China and France will have transaction level information on firm trade flows by product and country. It's quite detailed. We're going to work at the HS6-digit level, which gives us plenty of categories to work with. One advantage of being able to match those data sets is that, of course, from the perspective of French firms downstream, we have information on firm size and productivity. This allows us to look at differential effects or throw in some controls. One advantage of having the match data for Chinese firms is that we can control for other characteristics of the product market upstream to make sure that we're focusing on specifically on market entry and number of suppliers. I wanted to give you a sense of some key patterns in the data with a few select summary statistics, and I will probably come back to some of these later on when I'm showing you the empirical evidence. But if you look at panel B, these are some key variables for the market structure at the 6-digit product level. So look at the number of Chinese firms to the rest of the world in a given. So first of all, in year 2000, China exported about 2,800 different 6-digit products. By 2006, that number had gone up to almost 3,700. So it had gone up by almost a third. If you look at the number of Chinese exporters specifically to France, the number of products, sorry, not number of Chinese, yeah, the number of products that China sold to France, that went up from about 2,100 to almost 3,000. So again, a pretty sizable rise. Within each product category, how many Chinese suppliers were there? Well, if you focus on Chinese exporters to France, for the average product, that number went up from 16 to 38, so it's more than double. But of course, the number of suppliers is very skewed across products. And in fact, for the medium 6-digit product, only 5 Chinese firms sell to France. So that's a very low number. And we use that as motivation for thinking about oligopolistic competition. By 2006, the number almost doubled, but still, we're talking single digits.
Please.
Yeah.
Please, Ricardo Arturo Pulgar here. May I ask a question, please?
Of course, please go ahead.
Yes, because there are two things. First of all, I would like to know, why did you choose the precise dates from 2000 through 2006? I don't know whether you have been following up these data sets, first of all. And secondly, what about multinational firms? Because sometimes most of those firms, they don't belong just to one country, but rather they have different centers across several places. So I would like to ask you that question, please. I would be very grateful for your answers, Professor Manova.
Thank you. So first, the data question. This is a data constraint. So China has undergone dramatic changes in the last 20 years. I would love to use that long panel from 2000 to 2020. The trade data you can extend easily through 2015. And so that long panel from 2000 to 2015, I have used in other projects. The problem are the industrial surveys for China. And everybody working with Chinese data kind of agrees that this first panel from 2000 to 2006, the data is very clean and good to use. The next few years, 7, 8, 9, there seems to be something wrong in terms of number of firms. There's speculation that the government has not disclosed the accurate figures and so on. Later on, after 2010, the data appears to be much more reliable in terms of, how the micro data adds up to match certain aggregates we know. So that's really been the data constraint. It might well change in the future. The good news is that a lot of change happened in those 7 years, so it's useful for our identification purposes. And these dramatic changes that you see over this 6-7 year horizon are a way to illustrate that. Your other question has to do with control variables, essentially. I thought I had them on the next slide. I don't, so I will come back to that and show you later on. But in our empirical analysis, the main variable of interest will be the number of Chinese suppliers for a given product, but we will be controlling for other characteristics at the product level. And this will actually include, what fraction of total Chinese exports are mediated by multinational companies. For the Chinese context, there are other important controls. So this includes, what fraction of Chinese trade is done under the processing trade regime, which allows firms to import inputs from abroad duty-free if they're meant specifically for processing and assembly and re-exporting. There's also been some secular productivity growth. So these are certainly important factors to account for, and we need to throw them in as controls. Okay, so let me show you these 3 stylized facts that motivate the way we build the model. So the first fact is two-sided firm heterogeneity. This is probably not going to be surprising to any of you, but it's nice to kind of visualize and see the extent of this heterogeneity in the data. What I'm showing you here in blue is the dispersion is in size and productivity across French firms that are importing a given product. So take a given 6-digit product, look at all French firms that are importing it from China, plot their distribution of log sales on the left side and log value added per worker on the right-hand side. The graphs I'm showing you have actually already demeaned by product. They have taken out that variation. And you see very well pronounced bow-shaped curves. You can actually do this looking at French firms importing a given product from the rest of the world. It doesn't have to be just China. And you're also going to see a lot of firm heterogeneity. So think of this as consistent with there being a lot of dispersion among buyers downstream. So let me now show you the equivalent figures for China, which is how you can think about heterogeneity across upstream suppliers. So here what I've done is, take a given 6-digit product, look at all Chinese firms exporting this product to France, and plot their sales and productivity dispersion. I have the mean by product to make sure that's not driving any of these patterns, and you again see quite a bit of heterogeneity. The patterns will look very similar if you look at Chinese exporters to the rest of the world. Okay, so that's fact 1. Fact 2 is meant to suggest that you have relatively few sellers upstream, which is going to motivate us to think about imperfect competition. So here, for each 6-digit product, I count the number of Chinese firms that export that product to France. You can obviously do the same by looking at the number of Chinese firms exporting to the rest of the world. And what I am plotting here is a histogram across products. And what you see is that, for more than half of all products, the number of Chinese exporters to France is 5 or fewer. So clearly a very concentrated market with a very few set of actors. And yes, of course, there is a very long tail with some products having lots and lots of potential suppliers. On the right-hand side, you see the C4 index. This is the share of total Chinese exports to France that are conducted by the top 4 exporters. Given that I tell you that for about, half of all products, you have 5 sellers or fewer, it's not surprising that, there's a huge number of products for which the C4 is pretty high. Finally,
sorry, this is Ernesto. Quick clarification question. So here, what you're doing with the data for different years is pooling all together?
This is for 1 year. I can't remember. This must be 2006, but I'm really not sure. So we did it for 1 year. It doesn't actually matter.
Okay, it's 1 year only. That's enough.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. The last fact, I think it's wrongly labeled matching frictions. What I think this title really should be is essentially heterogeneous activity in the network or network asymmetry. We know from this literature that some firms are very active in production networks and they match with many buyers and suppliers. And then there's a long tail of firms that have many fewer links. So this is what this graph is really meant to illustrate. Now, I told you that we discussed in theta, we don't actually have seller-buyer identities. The best we can do is count number of transactions. So here in blue on the left side, what I'm showing you is, take a firm and a given secret product, and count the number of import transactions. And as you see, for the vast majority, there's a large majority of firms that are going to have only one or two, single-digit transactions in a given product. And then there's going to be this long tail of, few firms that are actually very active. They have multiple import transactions. Things look very similar from the flip side when you ask, take a Chinese exporter of a given product, how many export transactions does it have? Well, there are many firms that have only just a few export transactions, and then a long tail of firms with, many more. And so, essentially, we know from data for other countries where the customs data identifies buyers and suppliers that there's a very high correlation between number of transactions and number of buyers and suppliers. So we just wanted to show you these figures as a way to illustrate that, that also holds in our data. So the network is sparse. Some firms are very active, others are not. Great, so I'm going to move on then to the model. And the goal here is to characterize the endogenous formation of the production network. And once we have done that, to understand how upstream entry will affect the sourcing behavior firms downstream. That is really our primary interest. And this is what we'll be able to take to the data. So the reduced form empirical evidence I'll show you will focus on that, how upstream entry affects firm level sourcing outcomes downstream. But of course, the advantage of having a general equilibrium model is that we can also speak to other questions we really care about that are more difficult to observe in the data. And one of them is consumer welfare downstream. We are focusing on entry upstream because that is the most important shock that happened in China over this window, but we can also use the model to speak about other counterfactuals. And given the model structure with those three ingredients, the two obvious other counterfactuals are, lower matching frictions and lower trade costs. Okay, so the way I will set up the model is by telling you what happens. I'll characterize first final demand. I'll then talk about downstream production, explain, the upstream production process, then talk about the matching of upstream suppliers and downstream final good buyers. And at that point, then I can go to propositions and result and essentially say, these are the optimal markup strategies of upstream suppliers for a given buyer. I can tell you this is the optimal sourcing strategy for a given buyer. And then I can have, I can then analyze what is the effect of entry upstream, what is the effect of cutting trade costs for matching. Right, so starting with final demand, multiple J countries, there will be nested consumer preferences over a tradable homogeneous good and some non-tradable differentiated varieties. The differentiated sector is where the action is, that's what we care about. And with the CES aggregate across differentiated varieties, we get a very familiar expression for demand per individual variety. So that just depends on aggregate expenditure, the aggregate consumer price index, and the price of the specific variety. Okay, so then let's now think about downstream production. Who makes these final goods? Well, these final goods are assembled by firms that buy intermediates globally. These downstream producers are monopolistically competitive. There's nothing interesting there. They each maximize profits by charging a constant markup above marginal cost. Marginal production costs depend on the firm's individual productivity, very much Mallet style. So you're going to have a core productivity draw from some distribution. And essentially that means that if you're more productive, you can make more stuff from the same set of inputs, right? Your marginal cost per unit of output is lower. Marginal production cost will then also depend on this input cost index across all inputs that the firm chooses to buy. So let me digest this for you. So the firm can source inputs from J different countries in K different sectors. And if it chooses to source from a given country and sector, then this little indicator variable I lights up and it becomes 1. Otherwise, it's a 0. If you're sourcing from a given country and sector, you can in principle buy varieties from multiple suppliers in that country and sector. And so what enters this overall input cost index will be an input cost sub-index, if you will, specific to that country and sector. So let me go ahead and unpack this. So, there is some elasticity of substitution across countries and sectors, but within each country and sector, you can purchase multiple input varieties. And so the input cost index among them looks like this at the bottom of your screen. The one thing that's worth pointing out is that different downstream buyers will face a different price for the same upstream variety B. And the reason for that is that the cost of an input will depend on seller characteristics, buyer characteristics, and seller-buyer match characteristics. So let me walk you through the intuition here. Conditional on sourcing a given input, a firm will buy the variety from its lowest cost possible supplier, and it's going to match with a bunch of suppliers and choose whom to buy that input variety from. Now, for any given supplier, the price they set to the buyer will depend on the marginal cost of the supplier and the pair-specific markup the supplier chooses to charge. So the supplier characteristics that is relevant here will be the supplier productivity. Fine. If you think about the match characteristic, we will see in a moment that if a supplier matches to a buyer with more suppliers, those input suppliers will compete amongst themselves, and each one of them will have an incentive to lower their markup. So essentially, buyer characteristics matter for these variety prices because more productive buyers will have different sourcing strategies. They will choose to match with different suppliers than a less productive buyer. There is also a pair-specific cost shock. So this is this little side end of the expression here. So think of that as a match-specific cost shock, which is realized after you meet the supplier. I mean, intuitively, this could be that you start transacting with a given supplier and you sort of realize that you need to make some adjustments to make that widget fit your production process. It could be that, something unexpectedly goes wrong and there's some default, there's some faults and so on. Technically speaking, these match-specific cost shocks are very convenient. They give tractability if you want to characterize some expressions. But empirically, the way that you can think of them is giving extra flexibility in the model. And this is something understood in the literature, right? So in particular, a lot of models that don't have these kind of match-specific cost shocks will imply a very strict pecking order in which buyers match with suppliers. So essentially, you take all possible suppliers, you rank order them by productivity. Every buyer should want to match with the most productive supplier, and better buyers that choose to match with more suppliers will just kind of keep adding suppliers in decreasing order of productivity. But at the end of the day, all buyers will be following the same pecking order. This reality is very far away from that. One way to generate deviations from a strict pecking order is to have these pair-specific constructs. Okay. Oh, the last thing I should mention is the cost of a given variety, input variety B to a given buyer, of course, is also a function of the iceberg trade cost. So this is a part of the model. Given that we're looking specifically at French imports from China, those iceberg trade costs are sort of the same for all firms. So that's why we don't pay attention to them too much in the rest of the exposition. But when we think about the effect of trade policy and cutting trade costs, this is where the action will be. Okay.
Kalina?
Yes?
This is Federico. Can I ask you something about this? So why do you, I mean, I guess you cannot merge the data at the firm-to-firm level. So why do you need this? Because in principle, like in the data, what you will be able to do is look at something like, you know, the number of links that China has for a particular, say, product, right, that they're selling to France, but you will not know which firm is matching with which supplier, right? So I'm wondering, like, what part of the data will help you to, other than say the number of links that a particular firm, I guess you won't have the number of links, say the most productive firms in France, exactly the number of firms that they're matching with, or the identity of the firms that they're matching with in China, right? So you won't be able to look at that in the data, I guess.
Exactly. So what the model...
So how do you take this, this part of the model to the data?
tells you that the number of links is actually an endogenous object. It would be interesting to study if we had data on it, but it is an endogenous object. So if you regress, say, at the firm level, if you regress input prices for a given product from China on the number of input suppliers from China, that's not a causal statement. That's a correlation between two joint outcomes of the firm's maximization problem. And I would like to run that correlation because it would help confirm, right, a prediction of the model, but it's not a causal result. And we want to get at the causal effect of entry upstream on sourcing downstream. And so essentially, we don't want to be looking at firm-to-firm links. All we need is the set of potential suppliers for a given product. And that we see in the data. Because in the data, we do know how many Chinese firms are exporting a given product in principle to anybody, right? Not just to me, but in general, who are the potential suppliers there? So even if you had the, complete firm-to-firm network, you would still want to run the regressions we run to check those causal effects. But you would also be able to run some additional checks for those correlated outcomes that the model generates. So that's the kind of work you can do with the data that you have for Chile, for example, right? Like in the domestic production network, you can look at those correlations. I've been looking at those kind of correlations for, say, Brazil. For Belgium, we weren't able to, because for most VAT data, you have firm-to-firm sales, don't have the product characteristic, and you don't have information on price versus quantity. I'm actually not sure whether in the Chilean data you see price, quantity, and product. I have another project on the go where we look at data for Brazil, and there the VAT records actually do have that extra layer of information. So you would see not just firm-to-firm sales, but you would see, for the same two firms, if you will, you could see multiple transactions in multiple products, and for each transaction, you have the price and quantity. So with that kind of data, you could also then validate these additional predictions of the model.
Okay, cool.
Okay, sure. So let me now kind of move one layer up and think about upstream production. Just to be sure, I have until 5:50. I have another 25 minutes. Okay. So upstream production. So upstream, there's going to be a discrete number of suppliers producing differentiated varieties. For each supplier, they have a constant marginal cost, but they will compete oligopolistically with other suppliers matched up with. And this is how they will form their optimal markups, to maximize profits from that specific relationship. So I now need to tell you how the matching game goes. Think of this as buyers and suppliers meeting at a convention center. They're meeting rooms, they're bidding rooms of different sizes. And essentially, upstream suppliers pay a fixed cost to attend the trade fair. They just need to register. And at that point, they can enter any room they want. Downstream buyers also pay this registration fee, but they also need to send sourcing managers. And if you want to enter a bigger room and meet more suppliers, you have to send more managers. Maybe you send a bunch of lawyers or accountants, what have you. So essentially, the fixed cost of entering a bigger room is higher. We're going to follow an assumption that others have made in this literature, that sellers enter rooms sequentially in increasing order of marginal cost. So let me tell you why we do it and what it buys us. So what it buys us is that you know exactly who is in a room if I just tell you the size of that room. So in other words, if I tell you you're entering a room with 5 sellers, you know that those 5 sellers will be the top 5 most productive sellers. If you enter a room with 6 sellers, it's going to be the same top 5 most productive sellers plus the 6th most productive seller. The reason why this is convenient theoretically is because it reduces some of them combinatorial possibilities in the background. Essentially, the downstream buyer will be choosing which room to enter, and there are only so many possibilities, right? If there are n upstream suppliers, there are n possible rooms to enter. Whereas if you don't have the sequential entry by suppliers, there will be sort of like 2 to the nth power, right? Multiple options there. How can you justify this in practice? One way to do this is to say, look, sellers themselves actually pay a higher fixed cost to enter a bigger room. And then endogenously, more productive sellers upstream will choose to enter bigger rooms because they remain highly competitive there as well. And more productive sellers will also enter more rooms than less productive sellers. So that's kind of the way to think about that. Okay, so buyers downstream, right? They have to make a bunch of sourcing decisions. So they need to choose their set of suppliers in terms of which kind of sectors to buy from. And then
Please,
yeah.
Please, Professor Manova, I would like to ask some questions about the buyer-seller matching process. Two things. First of all, please, have you included an opting out cost into the analysis? Because sometimes when you've got a seller which provides a key input in your productive process, it is very difficult to opting out for another firm due to the cost of breaking up the agreement. First of all, secondly, is it possible that I don't know, when you've got 2 firms downstream in which they have very good relations, that they may invite, between quotation marks, an upstream firm saying, look, you should ask that these guys, they provide very wonderful service. You should try their services. I would be very grateful for your answers.
Thank you. Right, so these are both good questions. We don't have either of those features. So the first one is, essentially the production function. Are there some firms that are different from others? Are there some inputs that are more important than others? No. We're going to assume that all the inputs enter symmetrically in the production function. That means there are no essential inputs. We have granularity in terms of suppliers, but not effectively granularity in terms of the inputs themselves. On the second question, I think that's fascinating. Essentially, everything we're doing here is cross-sectional. And when I talk about the effects of different shocks, think of that as, a bank solution comparing one steady state to another. I think in a richer framework, it will be certainly interesting to think about dynamics of these relationships. And I know that this is on the agenda of many people who are studying trade networks. Reputation effects is part of that, but part of it is also understanding, even if buyer-seller reputation is developing well, even if buyer-seller characteristics are constant, there may be, some shocks that are exogenous, right? There may be cost shocks, there may be macro shocks. And so empirically, it's actually going to be quite challenging to disentangle dynamics within the relationships that reflect reputation effects and sort of the endogenous evolution of the buyer-supplier interaction, from those kind of macro shocks. And essentially, if you see that a firm is changing its mix of suppliers or its sourcing strategy of suppliers, how are you to know? Is that because there's some dynamics within each supplier, or is it because of unobserved shocks across suppliers, or is it because of the firm is actually just responding to some aggregate shock? So And I have another project on the go working with Pakistani data, actually, where we have the customs data with information on foreign buyers and suppliers. And we're focusing on trade with China because Pakistan signed an important trade agreement with China in the middle of our panel. That is a panel with 15 years worth of data. And we are actually actively trying to understand exactly how firms adjust sourcing across suppliers in response to a trade reform. So I think with that project, we're realizing we have to actually put some structure on the question and think about, based on the results we find, can we actually say with certainty that there are, IID shocks over time or reputation effects, or is it really just the adjustment to the trade reform? And I think one of the results we're seeing is that, when trade costs fall, you increase your number of suppliers. So you can think of that as a transition from one steady state to another. But if you look at the second moment, if you look at like churning of suppliers, adding and dropping suppliers, you see that that also continues over time. But it goes up for some firms and goes down for others. And what we're thinking currently is that, in that case, trade reforms lower both matching costs and trade costs. And so it might also optimize firms to change the way they re-optimize their supplier set in steady state. So this was a long detour to answer your question, but I think it's just a way to say, in this literature on firm-to-firm production networks, I think the next frontier will be dynamics. And I know that several teams of authors working with this kind of data are starting to think about dynamics. It's hard. So we're still all trying to understand the cross-section before we can make progress on the dynamics. Great. So let me characterize the sourcing decisions of the buyer. Like I said, you choose which markets to source from. Within each market, the supplier set. And then, conditional on that supplier set, how much you're going to buy from different input suppliers. With everything I've given you, especially the first check cost shocks, it actually becomes easy to characterize the market share of one individual supplier in a buyer's total input expenditures. That's just a function of that seller's price relative to the overall input cost index for that market. This allows me to give derive expressions for the input cost index of firm B, sourcing varieties from, a particular country and sector. And this is just an aggregate across the prices that different suppliers in that country sectors charge, multiplied by the iceberg trade cost. This is the object we're going to work with in the data. So in the data, your unit of observation will be a French firm product, and we'll be looking at the price, the average import price across different imports transactions from China. And then we also have the data on, of course, import quantity at the French firm product level, and we have theoretical expression for that as well. If you aggregate up across these country product cost indices, you can, of course, go back to the aggregate, the overall cost index at the firm level. Okay, let me go straight to propositions so that I have time for the empirics. So this is an existence result. There is a unique Nash equilibrium in which suppliers set those optimal markup that you see on your screen. Instead of going to the formula, let me just give you the intuition for the result. So suppliers set higher markups if they have a bigger market share in the downstream buyer. If buyers have fewer suppliers, when they're less diversified, each supplier essentially has a higher market share. Input markups are also higher when final demand is less elastic. And the intuition here is that downstream buyers essentially can pass through higher input costs to their consumers. And finally, input markups will be higher if inputs are less substitutable across and within country sectors. Those are actually more important. So the second result is the first time we see this for competitive effect. If a firm sources from more suppliers, each supplier will have a lower market share in its total input purchases. Each supplier will be charging a lower markup, and the firm will have lower input costs overall. So this result that the overall input cost index of the firm falls actually combines several effects. On the intensive margin, because you're inducing tougher competition among suppliers, each one charges a lower markup. On the extensive margin, there are several things going on. There are variety gains because you're using more inputs in production, and you're allocating input purchases more effectively across different suppliers, in response to those match-specific cost shocks. On the flip side, there is actually a slight loss, right, to increasing the set of suppliers, because on the margin, you're matching with progressively less and less productive suppliers that have higher marginal costs. Okay, so now I've told you how you optimize input purchases across suppliers, conditional on your supplier set. And the last thing remaining is to ask, well, what is the optimal supplier set? Sorry about that. My husband and I are sharing an office and he forgot I'm presenting, so he's sending something to the printer. Okay, right. So the buyers are going to choose the optimal supplier set by maximizing overall profits. That's a function of their variable revenues and all of their fixed costs of matching with suppliers in all these different rooms for the different countries of origin. So I can now tell you what the optimal sourcing strategy of the firm is. Oh, whoops, I should go back and say the overall input cost index then, once I've expressed it in terms of those endogenous prices that suppliers set, I'm going to call that a sourcing capability. But this is effectively the input cost index of the firm. So here's the result for a firm's optimal sourcing strategy. For downstream buyers, the set of input suppliers is non-contracting in productivity, and sourcing capability is non-decreasing in productivity. Now, there are a couple of conditions for these results that are consistent with what we have seen in the literature. So the first condition is actually quite intuitive, sourcing complementarity. Inputs are more complementary in production than output products are in consumption. The second condition is one of strategic complementarity in price setting among suppliers. There is a site missing here. Amity at Talkie recently found evidence for that when looking at exchange rate pass-through. And it essentially gives rise to this new pro-competitive effect in our framework. A nice implication of this result is that we can rationalize negative degree assertivity in the way firms match. So one thing we know is that more productive buyers have more suppliers, but their average supplier sells to fewer firms, right? So if I have more links, my partners tend to have fewer links on average. And that result is because of this pecking order, if you will. And so I'm adding suppliers in decreasing order of supplier productivity. More productive suppliers have more buyers. Another implication of this proposition is that the endogenous sourcing in this network will amplify the productivity advantage of downstream firms and acts to lower their marginal costs even further. I will skip this and go straight to the main prediction for the impact of market structure. Under sourcing complementarity, a rise in the number of potential suppliers upstream will in fact change sourcing outcomes downstream. So it will weakly increase the number of suppliers to a particular buyer, and it will weakly reduce that buyer's input cost index, increasing their input quantities and purchases. On the margin, these effects are going to be greater for more productive buyers. Why? It's best to illustrate that with a figure. So here, imagine that on the horizontal axis, you order buyers by productivity, and on the vertical axis, you have the number of possible suppliers in a given market and how many of those firms choose to source from. So in this particular example, these steps, there are 3 steps. So there are 3 maximum suppliers in a given market. The least productive firms don't outsource at all. Those in the middle buy from 1 supplier, from 2 suppliers. The most productive guys match with all 3 suppliers. If you now see market entry upstream, and 3 additional suppliers enter, well, these less productive firms don't actually change their sourcing strategy. It's not optimal for them because of the fixed cost of matching with more suppliers. Conversely, for those productive firms above certain cutoffs, this is quite attractive. So they are going to expand this supplier set and as a result benefit from lower margin costs. The final prediction of the model is something that we can evaluate with counterfactuals, but not take the data. And it has to do with the impact of trade policy and matching technology. So if you lower trade costs or matching costs, you're going to induce buyers to expand their sourcing strategy, weekly more suppliers. As a result of that, buyers are going to benefit from lower input cost indexes and higher input purchases. Now, in this particular case, the effects are actually greatest in the middle of the productivity distribution. So let me show you these stairs once again. So effectively what's happening is that in this market, there's still only 3 potential suppliers. So as a downstream buyer, if you're already matching with all 3 of them and trade costs fall, well, you still continue to match with all 3 of them. Your input costs are going to go down because for those 3 suppliers, you're benefiting from lower iceberg trade costs, but you're not matching with more suppliers. Really, where the action is on this extensive margin of suppliers is in the middle of the distribution. Those are the firms that actually expand their supplier set. And so in the middle of the distribution, you would also expect to see higher gains in terms of lower marginal costs. Okay, let me pause here. Or actually, you know what, I won't, because I am short on time. So I will go through the empirical results and then we have time at the end for discussion. Right, so a lot of what I'm going to say now has already come across. And I think this will allow me to cover quite a bit of ground in a short period of time. So I don't think this will feel rushed, even though, it's disproportionately little time compared to how much I spent on the model. Let me remind you what the empirical context is. We're interested in the impact of the upstream market structure in China on the sourcing behavior of French firms. These are 2 large open economies, but they occupy very different segments of the global value chain. And during this period, China went through some dramatic changes. So barriers to entry were relaxed. Some trade-oriented special economic zones were set up, and a lot of infrastructure was designed essentially to support trade activity. So this effectively is a large and exogenous supply shock from the perspective of French firms downstream. This is another way to illustrate the extent of this market entry in China. So here I'm showing you the cumulative distribution function of the number of firms selling a given product across 6-digit products. And the red line corresponds to year 2000. So for year 2000, you sort of see that in about 60% of products, we had, 7 or fewer Chinese sellers. And by year 2006, that number went down to about 40%. So there was clearly sort of a first sort of stochastic dominance here. Here is the empirical specification. The unit of observation will be a French firm, 6-digit product and year. And at that level, the outcomes of interest are 3. So we're looking at total import purchases by firm product year, and then quantities and unit values, prices. On the right-hand side, the main variable of interest will be a measure of the market structure in China. And the model tells us that the correct measure to use is the number of Chinese suppliers for a given product. Again, to be cautious, we're going to look at the number of Chinese exporters to the rest of the world. But in principle, you can use the number of Chinese exporters to France because that number is exogenous from the perspective of one individual French firm. It's worth pointing out, it would not be model consistent to look at, say, a C4 concentration index or a Herfindahl index, because those are actually endogenous outcomes of how networks are formed. And they also depend on functional form distributions. So for that reason, the number of firms is actually the model consistent measure. Okay, in terms of controls, we're going to include a full set of product and year fixed effects as well as product specific time trends. This is going to soak up a lot of supply and demand shocks. We're also going to include firm fixed effects. So effectively, we'll be looking at the variation across products within a firm and over time. To rule out omitted variable bias, I'm going to include a bunch of other controls, and these are the summary statistics for them. But let me just list them. Things came up earlier in the talk already. There was secular productivity change during this period in China. So we want to be able to control for the average productivity of Chinese suppliers of a given product, right? Because the change in the number of suppliers may have come from entry in the left or the right part of the distribution, we don't know. The whole productivity distribution may have shifted. Because we can match the Chinese customs data to the Chinese balance sheets for all Chinese firms that export a given product in the customs data, we can look at the balance sheet data and look at their value added per worker, or more sophisticated proxies for productivity, and then we can come up with an average productivity across the suppliers of a given product. If you're worried about changes in the productivity distribution, well, we also control for the second moment with the standard deviation. You can do other stuff as well. It doesn't change the result. Because of China's use of imported inputs in production, we have also seen, in other work I've looked at that as well, that product quality has changed in China a lot over time. And as Chinese firms have started importing inputs of higher quality, it has allowed them to also produce and export outputs of high quality. That's something we can control for as well. We do what's standard in the literature, what I've done elsewhere as well. For each Chinese firm, you look at their average imported input price, and that becomes a proxy for their input. And then, very China-specific things you can share, you can control for, what share of Chinese exports in a given product are done on the processing trade regime or are mediated by multinationals or intermediates. Something that hasn't yet come up is, what about the market structure in France? So I'm obviously emphasizing what's happening with the market structure in China because that has changed a lot over time. Market structure downstream has not. But just to be cautious, we're also controlling for the number of French firms that are importing a given product from the rest of the world. Something else that I don't have on this slide, but we've also done, is looking at how many French firms are in a given output industry. So these are sort of two different ways of thinking about the market structure downstream. And the good news is that none of these controls really matter for our results. So let me go to the baseline set of results. So here, as I go from left to right, we're adding progressively more fixed effects and controls. So the most stringent specification is column 4. And again, the unit of observation is a French firm product here. So if you look at column 4, an increase in the number of Chinese sellers of a given product has definitely triggered downstream firms in France to, import more at lower prices. And it's a result of that they have higher imports. The economic magnitudes are sizable. So one interesting comparative static is to say, imagine that, you increase the number of Chinese suppliers by 1 standard deviation. What would that imply? In an absolute sense, it would mean that import values per, from product would go up by about 30% on average. And this reflects, import quantities going up by about 40% and unit values dropping by about 10%. If you want to put that into perspective, you may want to ask, well, what share of the total variation in those outcome variables is that? And the answer is roughly, a 12% standard deviation. So the economic magnitudes, I think, are sort of meaningful and clearly significant. We've done extensive robustness analysis. This is actually some of what we have done, and we're waiting for another table of results to be disclosed. And so I'm not going to belabor the point, other than to say, things are quite stable. If you restrict the sample to be balanced, so only from products that are always active over the period. If you look at a CES, essentially weighted input price index, you get even stronger results. This is something else the model gives clear predictions for, right? So far, I was showing a simple unweighted average price across import transactions, but in fact, of course, you would be buying more from cheaper suppliers. So it would be more accurate to take a CES input cost index, and that's what we do in this column. The last two columns think about an IV strategy, where in column 6, we're looking at the number of Chinese firms exporting a product to France as opposed to the rest of the world. And in the very last column, we're instrumenting that number with a predicted number of exporters based on the fact that some export size restrictions were gradually lifted. So I didn't give you information on this instrumental variable, but essentially at the start of the period, Chinese firms had to meet a minimum size requirement in order to obtain an export license. And over time, that requirement changed gradually until it was completely removed in year 2004. What's nice for identification purposes is that this direct export restriction, DER, changed differentially across products, regions, and industries. And there was also distinction between state-owned enterprises versus private domestic firms. So essentially, we can use this reform to infer, you look at the number of Chinese sellers at the start of the period, and you infer the potential set of exporters later on in time as these restrictions were removed. Okay, the final table of results I'm going to show you looks at downstream heterogeneity. So remember what the model predicts here is that if the set of suppliers upstream increases, the firms that will benefit most downstreams are actually the more productive ones. So if you remember those stairs I showed you, the greatest shift there is to the right, because for those highly productive firms, it's worth paying the extra fixed cost of matching with more suppliers in order to lower their marginal costs. So I want to focus on those last three columns in this table. The model tells you that you want to look at firm productivity or size. If you're careful, from the perspective of the seller, what matters are the total input purchases of a given buyer. They don't actually care if that buyer is, has higher sales or is more productive. What really matters for them for setting optimal markups are, total demand of that buyer. I say this because in the context of global value chains, one has to be very careful in measuring firm size and productivity. For downstream firms, it's misleading to look just at employment or just at sales, because when you're outsourcing, you're essentially replacing employment with purchased inputs. So employment in-house is not a perfect measure of size or productivity anymore. And of course, sales doesn't contain information about value added versus inputs, right? So we are looking at those measures for firm size downstream as well. But the ones that the model tells you are the most accurate to use are specifically import values. And that is in fact where you see the strongest results, okay? So those results were the effects of number of Chinese suppliers on import values, quantities, and unit values are strongest for downstream firms that import more overall. So let me stop here and wrap up. So to take a step back, right, I started by motivating this project with the rise of global value chains and superstar firms. And I think we've provided a theoretical rationale for why, the market structure upstream will affect sourcing decisions downstream. And looking forward, some of the open questions have to do with the optimal design of trade and industrial policy, as well as these dynamic gains from global sourcing. These sort of came up in the context of reputation effects within buyer-supplier links. Well, one can think more generally about dynamic gains if you think that there are any learning externalities, knowledge transfer essentially in networks. So let me stop there. I know I've gone over time and I want to make sure that there's still a bit of chance for discussion.
Thanks, Kalina. Thanks a lot. So we have a couple of minutes for discussion, so feel free to jump in and ask questions.
May I?
Yes, please.
Ernesto is here. So this has been very interesting. One thought is that the data limitations of having data only on China as suppliers is a little bit unfortunate, because my understanding is that the country dimension really means nothing in the story. It's about the direct competitors for a given supply. And in that sense, maybe one may think, even if the results look great, one may think whether the whole extent of competition is really being captured using only the Chinese data.
So that's an interesting point. So I can answer that theoretically and empirically. So theoretically, if you look at the model, if you take the model seriously, the production function is such that the elasticity of substitution across suppliers from the same country is different from that across countries. And so essentially what that means is that you're matching separately for each country. And the fact that, you match with suppliers in China, that has nothing to do with how you source from Japan. And essentially, the Chinese firms compete among themselves, the Japanese firms compete among themselves. So nothing there invalidates that. And so in that sense, you would say you can run the exact same exercise where you don't look just at bilateral imports from China, but also at bilateral imports from the rest of the world. If we had done that, we could, because we certainly have the French, import data to attempt that. Our thinking was that we want to focus at imports specifically from China because China experienced this dramatic transformation. So that's where you actually see a lot of entry upstream. And this wouldn't be true everywhere else. I'm sure it's true some other places. And of course, the other reason we did that is because for China, we had the firm level data because we want to have information on those firms and control for their productivity and so on.
I mean, very, very quickly, I mean,
yeah.
This distinction in the model about countries is something convenient to get a map into the data available, but it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, and China is not the only country that experienced a rapid production change. So, but I understand that the data is what it is, and that's what it allows.
It did help. No, I completely agree with you. One thing we have done, I can't remember if this is part of our baseline set of controls or not, but for each firm, you can actually control for its imports of the same product from the rest of the world, right? You can also control for the number of imports from the rest of the world. You don't have information on the number of suppliers in the rest of the world because you don't have the underlying data, but that's a control you can throw in. And this, at least, I think, goes towards addressing your concern in some way, because, if you think that there's some interaction between the Chinese suppliers and the rest of the world suppliers of the same product, at least you're controlling for what's happening in the rest of the world.
Kalina, I have a question about sort of all this issue of how competition affects your results and the mechanism you're thinking about, in the sense that you have this asymmetry in which sort of it's really important how the downstream buyers are making the decision, but in some sense you have the data to kind of think of this a bit more symmetrically, right? In the sense that the market structure in China can affect France, but also the market structure in France can affect China, right? So I know that at the end of the day, you want to say, okay, France is small for China in some sense, so maybe what's happening in France doesn't loop back to China, but maybe for the specific products that sort of are important, maybe for those specific products that China trades with France, thinking about the market structure in France is important to think about like loop effects that sort of kick back China's decision of how many firms enter in a particular product, right? So I was thinking whether you can sort of think, or whether you have thought about thinking about the market structure more symmetrically in terms of how these firms at each side of the market are searching and also bargaining when they're making the decision, and also take that to the data to think about these sort of loop effects of how the market structure in China affects France, and then back and forth.
Thanks for this. So absolutely. So here's what we've done, and I think I rushed through this, unfortunately. Okay, so we're in a world where, from the perspective of a producer upstream, there are no credit constraints, there are no capacity constraints. So the decision to serve one customer is independent from the decision to serve another customer. Yeah. So for that reason, we don't think about, how the number of customers affects my pricing. I kind of need to decide how much to charge this buyer and then how much to charge that buyer. It's not that those two buyers come together and in any way that affects my capacity constraint or credit constraint. So there are no interdependencies across buyers. So that's kind of the logic. What we have done empirically, though, you might like. So at the product level, we know, how many French firms are buying that product from China. We can control for that. So it's like the downstream equivalent of how competitive, if you will, or concentrated is demand for that input. And that doesn't seem to make a difference for our results. For each downstream French firm, the unit of analysis is the French firm product, the product that's being imported. So from the perspective of this French firm, this is an import. But you can also ask, well, what is this French firm making, right? And we know it's primary output industry from the balance sheets. So another way of thinking about the role of downstream market structure is not so much in terms of, looking up who is buying these inputs, but more like looking down. I, as a buyer, what industry do I belong to and how competitive is my industry? And so what we have also done is actually count the number of French firms in my output industry and controlled for that. Again, that doesn't make a difference. So kind of empirically, those are the kind of controls we have done. But I agree with you that there's sort of a deeper issue here. How do you think about markups and price setting along a supply chain or in a network? And that kind of is not trivial. Both the linear thing in terms of a supply chain and the network thing. There's very little work on that. It's done in development where they say, for example, look at commodities from the small scale farmers to intermediaries. They grow, I forgot, it was like coffee beans, then the millers, and whatever. In trade, I have not seen systematic work on that. So Antras and Choi have done some work on upstreamness, right, where they think of the linear sequencing in a supply chain. And they have thought about optimal price setting, but essentially in their model, there are these different cases depending on parameter values. It all has to do with elasticity substitution. And effectively, what you need to specify is the production function at each step of the supply chain. And the elasticity substitution across inputs in this part of the supply chain, in this part, and then you have to make assumptions. Is this elasticity, how is this changing along the supply chain? Is it even monotonic or nonlinear? So I think that generally, I don't think this question has an easy answer. If you have imperfect markets in multiple locations of the supply chain, I don't think that is theoretically, you can write down the problem, you cannot solve it. It will definitely be kind of parameter state dependent. And so the answer is that, I think the only way to go is empirically to try to control for these things, which is what we have done.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so unless there's any other question, I think we are on time.
Yes,
yeah.
Professor Huneeus, please.
Go ahead.
First of all, Professor Manova, congratulations on your research. And secondly, I have an administrative question for you, Professor Manova, and to Professor Huneeus. Will the slides be available? Please, I would be very grateful.
Feel free to circulate them, Federico. I don't know what your usual policy is at the bank.
Okay, yeah. So the video was recorded, and I think it's gonna be somewhere uploaded, so you can check that. Yeah. And if you're okay with sharing the slides, we can also make those available.